So we've spent a lot of time this semester learning scientific theories, scientific information, understanding our physical world through a scientific perspective. And for our last lesson here, what I want to do is look at how that scientific information gets put into practice, right? How do we take all these things that scientists have learned about our world and turn them into something that helps us to live in this world? And the case study that we're going to use to think about some of these issues is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So following on from the lessons that we've been having the last few weeks that focus in on climate change, we're going to look at an institution that is the most prominent hub for scientific knowledge about climate change. So our goals here are first for you to be able to explain what the IPCC is, and then to examine the role of climate science in policymaking and public discourse. So what do we do with this scientific information? So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is an organization that was established in 1988 by the World Meteorological Association and the United Nations Environment Program. So we have these two pre-existing international organizations, one focused on the environment, one focused on how our atmosphere works, right? Meteorology is the study of the short-term condition of our atmosphere. And these two organizations came together to create the IPCC. It has 195 member countries, so that's pretty much all the countries in the world. So this is very broadly an international organization. Everybody's part of the IPCC. It's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. And back in 2007, the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with former U.S. Vice President Al Gore for their work on climate change. So this is, a pretty mainstream recognized kind of organization here. And the current chair of the IPCC is Ho-Sung Lee, who is an economist from Korea. So the IPCC itself is made up of climate scientists who are appointed by the member countries. So the United States is one of the member countries of the IPCC. So the United States will put forward the names of some of our climate scientists, American climate scientists, to be part of the IPCC, and then France will put forward their climate scientists, and Australia will put forward their climate scientists, etc. So all of these scientists from the member countries will make up the IPCC. And the scientists act as both subject matter experts and representatives of their government. So they're subject matter experts. They're scientists. They have a deep understanding of the scientific theories and studies and everything that go into how we understand the climate system to work. But they're also there as representatives of their government. They're appointed by the government of their country. So in this kind of hybrid role as both scientists and political representatives doing their work on the IPCC. And the scale of this is huge. So the most recent major report put out by the IPCC was the sixth assessment report, and that involved 234 scientists from 66 countries who reviewed over 14,000 scientific papers in order to put this assessment report together. So it's a big undertaking. It takes many years for the IPCC to do the work that they're doing. And the most sort of headline work that they do, the biggest thing the IPCC does, is to put out these assessment reports. So these are periodic summaries of the state of climate science. They summarize what do we know about our climate right now. What can science tell us about the climate system, about the way that human activity is affecting the climate system? And so, as I said, the most recent one is the sixth assessment report that came out in 2021 and 2022. They've released it in kind of pieces. There are different chapters to it that come out as each working group, each set of scientists working on a particular part of climate science finishes their work and puts it together. So the most recent one is that sixth assessment report, and you can see there that goes back to 1990. We have the first assessment report report, and so every 5-ish years we get a new assessment report coming in. And so these assessment reports are summaries of the state of climate science. They're not original research. So all of these scientists that are part of the IPCC, along with lots of others, are doing research. They have their own research projects that they work on, papers that they publish and everything as part of their work outside the IPCC. But when they come together to create these assessment reports, they're not doing any new research. They're simply taking the existing research, the existing publications of existing studies about climate science, and they're synthesizing them. They're putting it all together. They're saying, if we combine all of these different studies that all touch on this same aspect of climate, what can we conclude when we put that all together? They're synthesizing all this existing research. They're not doing their own original research. The other thing to make note of is that these assessment reports are not policy recommendations. So they may discuss policy in the context of describing what the effects of different policies that have been adopted are, but they're not telling us what policies we should adopt in the future. You're not going to find in the IPCC report a list of recommendations, we should pass this law or that law, we should put this much money towards this program, anything like that. That's not part of the IPCC process. The idea is that this is simply telling us what science understands about the climate system, and then policymakers will take this science and then base their policy on it. That's the ideal, right? The hope is that if we can have this neutral, authoritative summary of what climate science says, what we understand about our world right now, that then policymakers who go into actually drafting the bills, negotiating the treaties and stuff, will use that as an input to decide which policies they want to pursue, which ones will achieve what kinds of outcomes for the world. So the process by which these assessment reports are put together draws primarily on peer-reviewed literature, with a lesser but not absent role for what's called gray literature. So gray literature is non-peer-reviewed information. So to understand what this is all about, we need to know a little bit about the peer review process. So peer review is a process by which a research paper that a scientist or a team of scientists has written is anonymously evaluated by other experts in the field. And those other experts will usually recommend some sort of changes, improvements to that paper before it gets officially published in a journal. And we get the kind of official public finalized version of the report on this research. So the idea here is that you've done your study, you've written up your report on what the study says, you submit it to a journal. The journal will take your name off of it so that nobody knows who you are. Nobody's going to be biased against you because they have like a personal beef with you or something. Send it out to these other experts. Usually there's 3 other experts that they try to consult. They try to get at least 3 opinions for a particularly challenging paper, one that maybe overturns or claims to overturn a bunch of things we thought we knew, or make a really big breakthrough. They might get additional people in just to make sure. They send it out to these other experts. The other experts will read the paper and they will give feedback. They will say, I think the conclusion is overinterpreting the data, or I think this graph is poorly constructed, or I think they should have used a different statistical test on this data. Lots of different things that the peer reviewers might have to say. Then those peer reviewers' reports get sent anonymously to the original author. So again, you don't know who's saying these things. You can't be like, oh, I don't care about that because I know that guy and I hate him. And then the original author takes those comments into consideration. They revise the paper, they resubmit it. Sometimes you go through a few rounds of that until the peer reviewers are happy, or the journal editor decides, well, this peer reviewer is never going to be happy, they're just being a jerk about it, we're going to ignore them. Because ultimately the journal editor has the final say. Peer reviews are just advisory. And then once you've reached that point, then the paper gets published. So that's why peer-reviewed literature tends to be more reliable than other research. It's gone through this extra step of feedback and input from other experts. That doesn't mean that peer-reviewed literature is always unimpeachable, that it's always exactly right about everything. Peer reviewers are not being paid for their time. It's something that you do kind of on a volunteer basis in order to contribute to the advance of science and as kind of reciprocity, because when you send in your paper, you're going to want people to peer review it. So, everybody kind of chips in. But, because you're not getting paid to do this, you only have so much time to read and think about a paper that you've been asked to peer review. You don't have any resources to, say, replicate their experiments to double check that they did it right. There are certain things you have to kind of take on faith. If somebody just totally makes up data, peer reviewers are probably not going to catch that because they're not going to have the resources to redo all of your research to double check it. So peer review is a filter, keeps out some obviously incorrect research. I think as much as we complain about all the nitpicking that peer reviewers do, I've certainly done that, my share of that. When I submit a paper and I get feedback that, you need to fix this, you need to cite this other paper and all these things, and I get a little cranky about it. But ultimately, it makes the paper better. Having that additional input makes it better, but doesn't guarantee that it's correct. It's just this extra layer of confidence that we can have. So the IPCC primarily draws on peer-reviewed literature, and in the last two assessment reports, they've really pushed to really focus on peer-reviewed literature and limit their use of this gray literature, this non-peer-reviewed literature, in response to a scandal that happened during the fourth assessment report. There was a claim in the fourth assessment report that glaciers in the Himalaya Mountains would be gone by 2035, and that was just presented as a fact in the fourth assessment report. But as people started to track down where this claim actually came from, it came through the gray literature, and they ultimately traced it back to an article in New Scientist, which is generally a good science magazine, but it's not a peer-reviewed journal. And they'd done an interview with a glaciologist who made that claim. That was just that person's opinion, but it got sort of by a game of telephone ended up in the fourth assessment report. And when that came out, it was a scandal. It was kind of embarrassing to the IPCC. It gets referred to as GlacierGate. And so in order to prevent things like that from happening again, they really focused on using peer-reviewed literature. But you can't get rid of that gray literature entirely. There's a cost to excluding the gray literature, which is that there's a lot of information out there that hasn't been peer-reviewed, that the people creating that information haven't had the means or the resources to go through that peer review process for reputable established journals. That's especially true for scientists working in poorer countries in the world. They don't always have the resources to get their stuff peer-reviewed in a way that would be recognized by scientists working in, the United States. So there's a cost to excluding gray literature. There's information that gets set aside, but then the benefit is that you don't have a GlacierGate type situation arising again. So each portion of the IPCC report is written by a team of authors, and then it's reviewed by other experts. So there's a peer review-like process that the IPCC report itself goes through. And it's also reviewed by political representatives from the member countries. So there's a political dimension to this as well. And the goal is to get a consensus. So the IPCC report needs consensus from everybody that is involved. And so, because you need to develop this consensus, and because this is a very lengthy process, it takes many, many years. They've just put out the sixth assessment report. They're already working on the seventh assessment report. It's going to be another 5 or so years till they get that one published. This means that the conclusions in the IPCC report tend to be conservative. They tend not to go out on a limb or make claims based on the most cutting-edge recent research because those things are, number one, they may not be published in time to get put into the synthesis process, even if they come out before the report itself is published. And they may be rejected by someone in the process. And so if you can't get that consensus, you can't put it in the report. So the conclusions in the IPCC report reports tend to be conservative. They tend to not make the most extreme kinds of claims, even if some of the people that are part of the IPCC believe those claims to be true and feel that there's solid evidence for it. The need for this consensus and this long process that it takes to get there tends to rein in those kind of claims. Another important thing to note about the IPCC reports is that they talk a lot about levels of certainty, because there are very few things in climate science that are 100% certain. There's always some amount of uncertainty, some range of uncertainty around any conclusion that we might make. And so to reflect that in the report, rather than saying, everything we say in the report, we're totally certain of, and if it's not in the report, we're certain it's not true. Instead, they give a likelihood that a conclusion is true. And so there's not a likelihood of something happening, this is a likelihood that the claim is true. So if something in the IPCC report is labeled virtually certain, what that means is that the scientists that are involved thought there was over a 99% likelihood that this claim is true. That there's only 1% or less chance that this conclusion is just an artifact or a mistake in some way. That very likely means 90% or more true. Likely is more than 66% true. About as likely as not, somewhere between 33 and 66% likely to be true. So these terms are telling you, again, not how likely it is that some event will occur, but how likely it is that the claim that's being stated about the climate is true, it's accurate, it's describing the real state of the world. So the IPCC produces this document of scientific knowledge, this sort of officially authorized summary of what climate science is saying. In order to translate that into policy, this information has to be used by political actors, by policymakers, by diplomats and legislators. And so this can happen at various levels, of course, right? You can have climate-related policy being adopted at the municipal level, right? Maybe the Borough Council of Slippery Rock wants to make some sort of local policy to deal with climate change. Maybe they would look to the IPCC report for some of the information that would help them choose a policy. But for the purposes of this lesson, we're going to focus on the international level of policymaking. So this occurs through what's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is the framework that's used for international negotiations about climate policy. And this is a treaty that was signed in 1992 at the so-called Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. So if you get deeper involved in environmental policy making and climate policy and stuff, you'll hear about the Earth Summit and about Rio a lot. So it's this very prominent international conference from countries all around the world, and they signed this treaty creating a framework for them to make policy about climate change. So this treaty didn't obligate anyone to do anything about climate change. It just created the structure by which future decisions would be made about international climate policy. And these discussions are held as annual-ish Conference of the Parties meetings. So this is a big, several-week-long convention where representatives from all of the countries that signed on to the UNFCCC get together somewhere in the world and they try to hash out specifics about what the various countries of the world will do to deal with climate change. So the most recent one, COP27, 27th Conference of the Parties, was held in November 2022 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And then the next one will be next year, COP28, in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. So if you've been seeing news referring to Sharm el-Sheikh, that's what they're talking about. That's COP27 that just wrapped up shortly before I started making this video. You'll also, as you're learning about international climate policy, you'll hear about two of the particular agreements that were made through this this framework that are among the more prominent ones, the ones that made the biggest commitments from different countries to actually do something. Right? Each conference of the parties comes out with some sort of an agreement, some sort of a result. Some of them are much bigger and more influential than others. So first we have the Kyoto Protocol, which was an agreement at a conference of the parties in the city of Kyoto, Japan, in 1997, that was designed to implement the UNFCCC by setting out targets for greenhouse gas emissions cuts by specifically the richer countries of the world. So the principle underlying the Kyoto Protocol is that richer countries have both greater ability to cut their greenhouse gas emissions because they have more resources at their disposal and more responsibility to do that because they both currently and historically have been putting out the bulk of those emissions. Right? Most of the greenhouse gases, the anthropogenic greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, were produced within the richer countries of the world, within Japan, United States, Western Europe in particular. So those countries under the Kyoto Protocol were supposed to meet certain targets for cutting their emissions. The United States never signed on to, the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol but never ratified it, so it never became legally binding. In the United States, it was rejected by the U.S. Senate repeatedly whenever it was proposed that we should ratify this treaty and become bound by it. So that was a pretty big hole in the Kyoto Protocol. The United States was one of very, very few countries that did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, certainly the biggest contributor to climate change that never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Then in 2015, at a conference of the parties in the city of Paris, France, we have the Paris Accord. This was meant as kind of a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, because the Kyoto Protocol had set out certain targets for greenhouse gas cuts by certain periods of time. That had now passed. We needed a new agreement to take on. So in Paris, there was this agreement that involved a set of voluntary pledges by countries. So rather than hard limits, you must cut your greenhouse gases by X amount, countries were going to make these voluntary pledges. And the big number that came out of Paris was 2 degrees Celsius of warming above the historical average. That was the target that countries were going to try to hit. We're already at 1 degree Celsius of warming. So we're halfway there already with not a lot of signs of slowing down. So that the 2 degrees Celsius, some people will say that it's that's allowing for too much warming. There's a good case to be made that 2 degrees Celsius will still be pretty catastrophic for the Earth, but it's also one that even that much is going to be tough to hit with the political processes that are in place and where we're at as a global community. So that is the political process, and at least in theory, all of the diplomatic representatives that attend these conferences of the parties should be looking to the IPCC reports as authoritative summaries of the climate science to base their policy making on. So what you're going to be doing in your lab assignment is, first, you're going to be looking at the IPCC report to understand how they go about synthesizing that climate science. What is it you're actually going to find in the IPCC report? And then you're going to evaluate whether that scientific knowledge is really being used in international climate policymaking at things like the recent COP27